The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Prince George walked quietly through the grand hallways. At 15 years old, he had grown accustomed to the daily routines that shaped royal life, but today felt different somehow. The usual bustle of palace staff seemed subdued, and even the normally chatty kitchen maids spoke in whispers as they passed by with silver trays laden with breakfast items. George paused near the great windows overlooking the palace gardens, watching as groundskeepers tended to the perfectly manicured lawns. His tutor had canceled their morning session due to a family emergency, leaving the young prince with an unexpected free morning. He decided to explore parts of the palace he rarely visited, taking advantage of this rare moment of solitude. As he wandered deeper into the palace's east wing, George noticed something unusual. The corridor ahead was lined with royal guards, standing at perfect attention, their red uniforms immaculate, and their tall black hats casting shadows over their faces. This wasn't entirely uncommon, but something about their positioning seemed more formal than usual. The guards stood closer together, creating an almost ceremonial pathway leading toward a set of ornate double doors George had never seen opened before. Curiosity getting the better of him, George approached the nearest guard. The man's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but George could sense a tension in his posture that spoke of something significant happening beyond those closed doors. The guard's name tag read Thompson, and George recognized him as someone who had served the royal family for many years. "Good morning, Thompson," George said quietly, not wanting to disturb whatever formal proceeding might be taking place nearby. "Is there something special happening today that I should know about?" Thompson's eyes flickered down to meet the prince's gaze for just a moment, before returning to their forward position. "Your Highness," he replied in a barely audible whisper, "there's a private ceremony taking place. A veteran's final salute ceremony for one of our own who served both in the military and here at the palace for over 30 years. George felt a sudden weight in his chest. He had heard about these ceremonies but had never witnessed one. They were held for palace staff members who had dedicated their lives to serving the royal family and had earned the highest respect from their colleagues. The ceremony was typically private, attended only by fellow staff members and immediate supervisors. "Who is it for?" George asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. "James Mitchell," Thompson replied, his voice catching slightly. "He started as a young guardsman when your grandfather was still Prince of Wales. Worked his way up to head of security for the family quarters. Been battling cancer for the past 2 years. But he kept working almost until the very end. He passed peacefully in his sleep 3 days ago." George's heart sank. He didn't know Mitchell personally, but he had certainly seen him around the palace. Mitchell was one of those steady, reliable presences who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, ensuring the family's safety without ever drawing attention to himself. George remembered seeing him standing quietly in corners during family gatherings, his keen eyes always watching, always protecting. "I had no idea he was ill," George said, feeling somehow guilty for not knowing about Mitchell's struggle. "Was he married? Did he have children?" Thompson nodded slowly. "Married to Sarah for 42 years. She works in the palace laundry. 2 grown children and 4 grandchildren. They're all inside for the ceremony now, along with about 30 of us who worked closely with James over the years." George stood in silence for a moment, processing this information. He thought about his own life, surrounded by luxury and privilege, protected every day by people like James Mitchell who dedicated their lives to serving others. It struck him how little he knew about the personal lives of the people who made his family's life possible. "The ceremony," George asked quietly, "is it something I could attend? Or would that be inappropriate?" Thompson looked surprised by the question. "Well, Your Highness, it's not really a royal protocol situation. It's more of a staff gathering to honor one of our own. I'm not sure what the proper procedure would be." George nodded thoughtfully. He understood the delicate balance of palace hierarchy and protocol, but something inside him felt strongly that he should pay his respects to James Mitchell. This wasn't about royal duty or public appearances. This was about acknowledging the service and sacrifice of someone who had spent his life protecting George's family. As he stood there contemplating what to do, George heard the faint sound of a single bagpipe beginning to play from behind the closed doors. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, a traditional Scottish lament that seemed to fill the entire corridor with its mournful notes. The guards along the hallway stood even straighter, if that was possible, and George could see the emotion on some of their faces despite their professional composure. The music continued for several minutes, and George remained perfectly still, listening and thinking. He imagined James Mitchell's family inside, saying their final goodbyes to a man who had clearly meant a great deal to many people. He thought about the years of service, the quiet dedication, the countless hours spent ensuring the safety and security of people Mitchell probably rarely had the chance to speak with directly. When the bagpipe music finally faded into silence, George made his decision. He turned to Thompson and spoke with quiet determination. "I want to pay my respects," he said simply. "Not as a prince making an official appearance, but as someone who wants to honor a man who spent his life serving my family. What would be the best way to do that?" Thompson looked uncertain. "Your Highness, I appreciate the sentiment, but this is really outside normal protocol. I'm not sure how the family would feel about royal presence at what's meant to be a private gathering." George understood Thompson's concern, but he also felt something deeper than protocol at work here. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "doing the right thing matters more than following every rule perfectly. James Mitchell spent 30 years serving my family. The least I can do is spend a few minutes honoring his service." From behind the closed doors, George could hear the soft murmur of voices as people began to move around, suggesting the formal ceremony was coming to an end. He knew he had to act quickly if he was going to do anything at all. "Thompson," he said with growing confidence, "I'm not asking for a formal introduction or special treatment. I just want to offer my condolences to his family and acknowledge his service. Surely there's a way to do that respectfully." Thompson considered this for a long moment, clearly weighing his duty to follow protocol against his respect for both the prince's wishes and James Mitchell's memory. Finally, he nodded slowly. "If you're determined to do this, Your Highness, perhaps the best approach would be to wait until the family comes out. You could speak with them briefly in the corridor. That way you're not disrupting the private ceremony, but you're still able to offer your respects." George felt this was a reasonable compromise. "That sounds perfect. I'll wait here with you until they come out." As they stood together in the quiet corridor, George found himself thinking about the nature of service and duty. He had been raised to understand that being royal meant serving the people, but he was beginning to realize that serving the people also meant acknowledging and honoring those who served him and his family. James Mitchell had been one of many people who worked behind the scenes to make royal life possible, and George felt it was important to recognize that contribution. The corridor remained silent except for the distant sounds of London traffic filtering through the palace's thick walls. The other guards maintained their positions, creating a formal honor guard that would escort James Mitchell's family when they emerged from the ceremony room. George noticed that several of the guards had small black ribbons pinned to their uniforms, a subtle but meaningful gesture of mourning for their fallen colleague. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, George heard the sound of the double doors opening. Thompson straightened to full attention, and George instinctively stood a bit straighter as well, preparing for what would be his first real encounter with grief and loss at this level. The first person to emerge from the ceremony room was an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her eyes were red from crying, but she held herself with quiet dignity as she walked slowly down the corridor. George immediately knew this must be Sarah Mitchell, James's wife of 42 years. She was followed by a younger man and woman who bore a strong resemblance to her, obviously the couple's children, and behind them came 4 children of various ages who clung to their parents' hands. George's heart ached as he watched the family process down the hallway. The children looked confused and sad, not fully understanding the finality of what had just taken place, while the adults struggled to maintain composure for their sake. The guards along the corridor remained at attention, but George could see the respect and sympathy in their faces as the Mitchell family passed by. Behind the family came a group of palace staff members, many of whom George recognized from his daily life in the palace. There was Mrs. Henderson from the kitchen, who always made sure his favorite biscuits were available at tea time. There was David from the maintenance crew, who had once spent an entire afternoon helping George fix a broken bicycle. There was Margaret from housekeeping, who had been working at the palace since before George was born. As the group moved slowly down the corridor, George stepped forward from his position next to Thompson. Several of the staff members noticed him and looked surprised, uncertain about proper protocol for this situation. The royal guards maintained their positions, but George could sense their attention focused on him, waiting to see what he would do. Sarah Mitchell had just reached the point where George stood when he gently stepped into her path. She looked up, startled to see the young prince, and for a moment seemed unsure whether she should curtsy or continue walking. George immediately put her at ease with his gentle expression and warm eyes. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said quietly, his voice filled with genuine compassion. "I'm Prince George. I wanted to express my sincere condolences for your loss." Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she smiled through them. "Your Highness," she whispered, "this is very kind of you. James would be so honored to know you came to pay respects." George reached out and gently took her hand in both of his. "Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to know that your husband spent 30 years protecting my family, and we are deeply grateful for his service. I'm sorry I never had the chance to thank him personally for everything he did." The sincerity in George's voice was unmistakable, and several of the staff members who had stopped to watch began to tear up themselves. This wasn't a formal royal appearance or a photo opportunity. This was a 15-year-old boy showing genuine respect and gratitude to a grieving widow. "He loved his work," Sarah replied, her voice stronger now. "Even when he was sick, he would talk about how proud he was to serve your family. He said it gave his life meaning and purpose." George nodded, still holding her hand. "That means everything to me and my family. Please know that his service will always be remembered and appreciated." At this point, James and Sarah's son stepped forward. He was a man in his 40s with his father's strong jaw and serious eyes. "Your Highness," he said, "I'm Michael Mitchell, James's eldest son. On behalf of our entire family, thank you for being here today. Dad always spoke so highly of the royal family, especially the younger generation. He believed you would all grow up to be good people who understand the value of service." George turned to Michael and shook his hand firmly. "Your father was absolutely right about the importance of service. He set an incredible example for all of us to follow." The daughter, who appeared to be in her late 30s, stepped forward as well. "I'm Emma," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Dad used to tell us stories about watching the family grow up, especially you and your siblings. He said it was one of the privileges of his job to see you all develop into good people." George felt a lump forming in his throat. "I wish I had known him better personally. From everything I'm hearing today, he sounds like an extraordinary man." One of the grandchildren, a girl of about 8, tugged on her grandmother's coat. "Grandma," she whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "is this the real prince?" Sarah smiled through her tears and looked down at her granddaughter. Yes, sweetheart, this is Prince George. He came to say goodbye to Grandpa with us. The little girl looked up at George with wide eyes. My grandpa said he knew you when you were little like me. He said you were very nice. George knelt down so he was at eye level with the child. What's your name? Lucy, she replied, suddenly shy. Well, Lucy, your grandfather sounds like he was a very special man. You should be very proud of him. Lucy nodded seriously. He taught me how to march like a soldier. Do you want to see? Before anyone could stop her, Lucy stepped back and began marching in place with exaggerated high steps, her arms swinging dramatically. The sight of this small child trying to honor her grandfather's military service in such an innocent way brought smiles to everyone's faces, even through their grief. George clapped softly when she finished. That was excellent marching, Lucy. I think your grandfather would be very proud. As this touching exchange was taking place, other palace staff members began to gather around, drawn by the unexpected sight of Prince George participating in their colleague's memorial. Word began to spread quietly through the palace that something special was happening in the East Corridor. Mrs. Henderson approached the group, wiping her hands on her apron. Your Highness, she said, I hope you don't mind me saying, but this would have meant the world to James. He was always so proud of his work here, and he had such respect for the family. George stood up from his conversation with Lucy and turned to address the growing group of staff members. I want all of you to know how much my family appreciates everything you do. People like James Mitchell are the backbone of everything we're able to accomplish. Without your dedication and service, none of what we do would be possible. A murmur of appreciation went through the crowd. Many of these people had worked at the palace for decades, but had never had direct personal interaction with members of the royal family beyond formal events and brief encounters in hallways. George continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. I realize I don't say this often enough, but every person who works here makes a difference in our lives. You're not just employees, you're part of an extended family that makes this place run. James Mitchell understood that, and he embodied the best of what that means. Thompson, who had been standing quietly nearby, stepped forward. Your Highness, if I may, he said. James always said that the measure of good leadership was how you treat the people who serve you. What you're doing here today would have made him very proud. George looked around at the faces surrounding him, people of all ages who had dedicated their careers to serving his family. Some had been there since before he was born. Others were relatively new, but all of them shared a common commitment to excellence and service that he was only beginning to fully appreciate. Thompson, George said, I want to learn more about the people who work here. Not just their jobs, but who they are as people. James Mitchell spent 30 years protecting my family, and I barely knew anything about him until today. That needs to change. Sarah Mitchell, who had been listening to this exchange with growing emotion, stepped forward again. Your Highness, she said, James would have been so pleased to hear you say that. He used to tell me that the best part of his job was watching the family grow and mature. He always believed that you and your siblings would understand the importance of treating people with dignity and respect. The corridor had become quite crowded now, with palace staff members gathering to witness this unprecedented interaction. Yet despite the crowd, the atmosphere remained respectful and subdued, as if everyone understood they were witnessing something special and meaningful. George realized that this moment had become about much more than paying respects to James Mitchell, though that remained at its core. This had become an opportunity to bridge the gap between the royal family and the people who made their lives possible. It was a chance to acknowledge the human connections that existed beneath all the formal protocols and hierarchies. As he looked around at the assembled group, George made a decision that would surprise everyone present, including himself. George took a deep breath and looked around at the gathered crowd of palace staff and the Mitchell family. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but rather than feeling overwhelmed, he felt a clarity of purpose that surprised him with its intensity. "I want to ask everyone here for something," he began, his young voice carrying a maturity that caught everyone's attention. "I want to ask for a moment of complete silence. Not just quiet, but absolute silence, to honor James Mitchell and everything he represented." The request was unexpected, but immediately everyone in the corridor understood its significance. This wasn't a formal royal protocol or a ceremonial gesture dictated by tradition. This was a 15-year-old boy asking for a simple but profound way to honor a man who had dedicated his life to service. Thompson was the first to respond, straightening to perfect attention and placing his hand over his heart. The other guards followed suit immediately, their red uniforms creating a striking visual display of respect and solidarity. The palace staff members, many of whom were not accustomed to formal ceremonial behavior, instinctively followed the guards' lead, standing straighter and adopting expressions of solemn dignity. Sarah Mitchell's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different tears now. These were tears of gratitude and amazement at the unexpected honor being given to her husband's memory. Her children and grandchildren gathered closer to her, sensing the importance of the moment even if they didn't fully understand all its implications. George himself stood at attention, his eyes closed, his head slightly bowed. The gesture was simple but powerful, and it seemed to transform the entire corridor into something sacred and meaningful. The silence that followed was indeed absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of London traffic and the barely audible whisper of air moving through the palace's ventilation systems. As the silence stretched on, something remarkable began to happen. Other palace staff members who hadn't been part of the original gathering began to appear at the far ends of the corridor. Word had spread quickly through the palace about what was happening, and people were quietly making their way to witness this unprecedented display of respect and solidarity. The head butler, who had served the royal family for over 20 years, appeared at one end of the corridor and immediately understood the significance of what was taking place. He stood at attention, joining the silent tribute without needing any explanation. A group of kitchen staff emerged from a side hallway, still wearing their aprons, and quietly took positions along the wall, adding their presence to the growing assembly. Even some of the administrative staff from the upper floors began to arrive, having heard through the palace's informal communication network that something special was happening. They came quietly, respectfully, adding their numbers to what was becoming an extraordinary gathering of the entire palace community. The silence continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes. During this time, George found himself thinking not just about James Mitchell, but about all the people who made his life possible. The cooks who prepared his meals, the housekeepers who maintained his living spaces, the maintenance workers who kept everything running smoothly, the security staff who ensured his safety every day of his life. He thought about how these people arrived at work each morning with a commitment to excellence and service, often working long hours for modest pay, finding satisfaction in doing their jobs well rather than in public recognition or praise. He realized that in many ways, they embodied values that he had been taught were central to royal duty: service, dedication, humility, and commitment to something larger than oneself. When George finally opened his eyes and looked around, he was amazed to see that the corridor was now filled with palace staff members. There had to be at least 50 people present, all standing in respectful silence, all united in honoring the memory of James Mitchell and what he represented. George slowly lifted his head and looked directly at Sarah Mitchell. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the continued silence, "I want you to know that this moment, right here, represents the very best of what your husband believed in. He believed in the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things through their daily service and dedication." Sarah nodded. too moved to speak immediately. The crowd remained silent, hanging on every word. George continued, addressing the entire assembled group now. James Mitchell spent 30 years protecting my family, but what I'm learning today is that he was part of something much larger than that. He was part of a community of people who believe that service to others gives life meaning and purpose. He paused, looking around at the faces surrounding him, seeing the impact his words were having. I want everyone here to know that my family sees you, appreciates you, and values you not just as employees, but as people. You're not invisible to us, and your service doesn't go unnoticed. Thompson stepped forward slightly, speaking for the first time since the silence began. Your Highness, he said, on behalf of everyone here, thank you for honoring James this way. This is something none of us will ever forget. George nodded, but he wasn't finished yet. I want to make a promise to everyone here today, he said, his voice gaining strength. I promise that I will do better at getting to know the people who work here. I want to understand your stories, your families, your hopes and dreams. James Mitchell had a full life outside these walls, and I want to honor that by recognizing the full humanity of everyone who serves here. The emotional impact of this promise was immediate and visible. Many staff members were openly crying now, moved by the sincerity and maturity of the young prince's words. This was far beyond anything they had expected when they came to work that morning. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward from the crowd. Your Highness, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. I've worked here for 18 years, and this is the most meaningful moment I've ever experienced in this palace. James would be so proud of what you've done here today. George smiled warmly at her. Mrs. Henderson, I've eaten your cooking nearly every day of my life, and I've never properly thanked you for all the care and attention you put into your work. Thank you. This simple acknowledgement had a ripple effect through the crowd. Other staff members began to smile, realizing that the prince actually knew who they were and what they did. It was a moment of recognition that many of them had never expected to receive. Sarah Mitchell finally found her voice again. Your Highness, she said, James always said that the greatest privilege of his job was watching the royal children grow into good people. Today, you've proven him right. Thank you for honoring his memory in such a beautiful way. George walked over to her one more time and took her hand. Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to know that your husband's example will stay with me for the rest of my life. He showed me what true service looks like, even though he probably never realized he was teaching me anything at all. As the formal gathering began to disperse, something beautiful happened. Instead of everyone quickly returning to their duties, people began talking to each other in small groups, sharing memories of James Mitchell and reflecting on what had just taken place. The corridor filled with quiet conversations, gentle laughter, and the kind of human connection that rarely happened in the formal environment of the palace. George found himself surrounded by staff members who wanted to thank him personally for what he had done. But more importantly, they began to share their own stories about James Mitchell, painting a picture of a man who had been much more than just a security guard. He had been a mentor to younger staff members, a problem solver who helped people navigate personal difficulties, and a steady presence who made everyone feel more secure and valued. Thompson approached George as the crowd began to thin out. Your Highness, he said, what you did here today wasn't just about honoring James Mitchell, though that was beautiful in itself. You showed everyone here that you understand what real leadership looks like. James would have been proud, but more than that, he would have been confident about the future of the monarchy. George looked around the corridor one more time, seeing it now not just as a hallway in a palace, but as a place where something important had happened. A place where the artificial barriers between royalty and commoners had been temporarily dissolved in favor of shared humanity and mutual respect. Thompson, he said finally, I think this is just the beginning. I have a lot to learn about the people who make this place work, and I'm looking forward to that learning process. As George finally walked away from the gathering, heading back toward his family quarters, the palace seemed different somehow. The same marble floors and ornate decorations were there, but the atmosphere had changed. The building felt more alive, more human, more connected to the real lives of the people who worked within its walls. Word of what had happened spread quickly throughout the palace and beyond. By evening, every staff member knew about Prince George's spontaneous tribute to James Mitchell and his promise to build better relationships with the people who served the royal family. It became a story that would be told and retold for years to come, not just as an example of royal kindness, but as a moment when a young man demonstrated the kind of leadership that comes from genuine empathy and respect for others. The palace had indeed gone still after Prince George's gentle gesture, but it was a stillness filled with meaning, respect, and hope for the future.